Of all the misguided cliches applied to Fat Ass 45, maybe the most egregious is the term populist. Whether or not the fat ass even has a coherent worldview beyond toggling between hedonism and resentment, it's easy to see how consciously and consistently crass, petty, ignorant, and arrogant he is, which makes him seem more like your everyday barroom blowhard than a dignified statesman. Yet millions of voters consistently assume that his faults are actually what make him relatable and man of the people. No, there's a certain snobbery in calling a douche like fat ass 45 a populist, because if not so subtly, it not so subtly implies that self governance is wasted on people who vote for him. If this is the people's champion, so the reasoning goes, then maybe we the people aren't really meant to call the shots after all. Be honest with yourself. Who amongst us hasn't felt that way at one time or another in the last 4 years? There's certainly no denying that the term populism has taken a beating lately. Its definition so mauled and devalued that the world is now barely more than a synonym for bottom beating. And that really pisses off Thomas Frank, who's a journalist and a political historian. Populism and fake populism have been the themes of my entire writing career. This is what Frank has said in an interview with the Daily Beast. When the world started being used as a synonym for racist authoritarianism, it really pissed me off. I had to investigate how this happened. Frank is best known for his 2004 bestseller, What's the Matter with Kansas? There he analyzed one of the biggest and most persistent ironies in modern politics: why the very people who have so little to gain from Republican policies keep voting Republican politicians in office. Frank suggests that the answer is a case of identity politics gone awry. You rail against those out-of-touch Washington elites or East Coast sophisticates and end up with the tax cuts for the fantastically wealthy and crumbling public schools. Frank, who's a proud progressive hailing from the Midwest, argues that there are in fact deeply progressive traditions that go overlooked amid the latest culture war kerfuffle, basically. In his latest book, The People Know, Frank examines what grassroots prairie populism, prairie populism was and what it was not, and how it was thwarted at the ballot box and why it's worth saving today. Um, Contradicting the accusations from elites both then and now, Frank demonstrates that the 19th century populists he refers to them as, which he refers to them as the pops, were often people who understood economics from a lively experience. He broke down what the what they understood, and that their contemporaries didn't. Number one, the economic rules are not handed down by God, because God doesn't exist anyway. But number two, that ordinary people have as much right to make demands on the government as do, say, railroad corporations. Number three, that concentration of wealth and political corruption go hand in hand. Evidently a century later, even those fairly simple but potent observations are lost and are more likely ignored by a majority in the Congress. The original pops were largely rural farmers, tradesmen, and small business owners who started seriously discussing how to make their concerns heard. It wasn't all crazy talk either, as Frank points out. Many of the populism's causes are familiar to us today: the regulation of monopolies, the income tax, the initiative and referendum, and the direct election of senators. If these ideas sound pretty commonsensical now, then credit is due to the egalitarian, community-minded populists. A footnote in the People Know explains. They explained that before the adoption of the 17th Amendment in 1913, senators were chosen by state legislators. It's good to be reminded of this slightly disturbing fact, especially when issues of proportional representation are being hotly debated. Some of the other items on the agenda might be a little dated in today's terms, such as the demand for free silver over the gold standard, but insisting on government control of currency and the railroads, as well as rooting out political corruption, are notions that don't sound that far off today. When otherwise arcane terms like the late capitalism are getting traction. Far from being no more than a case of the great unwashed getting unruly, the pops were deeply concerned with economic justice, internationalism, and accessible education for its own sake. The goal was to lift otherwise neglected communities through improving the material and intellectual living standards whenever possible. They were far less concerned with the hot-button culture war issues of their own time, like prohibition, and took an open-minded perspective on social society, on social policy, and yeah. So for the most part, they refrained from denouncing ordinary people for their bad values, Frank points out. They regarded many of the controversies of the day as traps or distractions. This might be a useful thing for activists and organizers to keep in mind, as it often seems like the Democrats waste energy painstakingly debating the next hot button issue. Naturally, this assertion of equal rights and equal worth wrinkled the well-heeled basically to prosperous Americans of the Gilded Age. Frank writes, it was unconceivable that intelligent human beings would wish to crack down on banks or ditch the gold standard. Populist grievances were irrational by definition. Mark Hanna, a Republican strategist who happens to be Carl's political hero, believed that some men must rule. The great mass of men must be ruled. Hanna took it upon himself to thwart the populist candidate William Jennings Bryan's chances in the 1896 presidential election by crushing Bryan under by crushing Bryan under a mountain of money. Not unlike today's world of dark money and unaccountable mega donors, the Republicans got to work, raising fear and alarm nationwide and putting their money behind the hysteria. Hanna raised gobs of cash anywhere he could find and spread fear and misinformation whenever possible. As one historian put it, a moral enthusiasm was to be beaten at every point in the line by machine-like domination of the actual polling, and it worked, and William McKinley won by a solid margin. It's so much easier to assume that ordinary people don't have what it takes to govern themselves when you see them as caricatures. The people know includes a vivid and amusing gallery of anti-populist cartoons from the period which appeared in popular journals, depicting the Pops as demented rebel-rousers bent on utter destruction. In one, the Pops are portrayed as a gaunt, wide-eyed ruffian who wear a tattered cape with populism on the side, glaring threateningly at the swells in top hats and tails, clenching a knife labeled murder in one hand and flaming torch labeled ruin in the other. On their head is a French Revolution-style stocking cap, red of course, that reads anarchy. Some things never change. Another more explicitly xenophobic cartoon ties the Pops to the fear of the lethal immigrant. A white-clad American lady lies dead after being stabbed by a swarthy assassin who is clearly intended to be a dangerous other. William Jennings Bryan is depicted as Satan himself, an especially ironic insult given that Bryan was actually a devout Christian, who famously argued that the prosecution's fundamentalist position in the infamous 1925 Scopes Monkey trial, the connection between Christian piety and progress values has been overshadowed these days, but it does not have to be another unnecessary victim of the culture war. Frank connects historical dots between the populist fervor for equality and FDR's New Deal and forward it to the civil rights movement. Another important link in the populist tradition, Martin Luther King is often hailed for his commitment to racial equality and pacifism, but his commitment to economic equality was every bit as fierce. King's mantra that all labor has dignity is described as an expression that could have come straight out of a populist manifesto back in 1891. The great civil rights organizer Bayard Rustin believed that lower middle class whites can go either way politically, depending on how issues are framed. Frank thinks that in today's political landscape, this is the real swing vote in America. Even though the opinion cartel doesn't want to discuss it for the usual self-interested reasons, talk to these people and you'll find they can be downright radical on economic issues. In recent decades, the Democrats has turned inward. The politics of identity, endorsed by the new Democrat emphasis on race, gender, and sexuality, is creating the model the personal is political, began to replace the more class-based solidarity of yesteryear. Experts and managers and academics became the new Democrat vanguard. This caused, Frank says, a historical backlash. Elitist was the word used to describe the emerging central Democrat. Established politics for people bedazzled by experts but contemptuous toward their blue-collar countrymen. Frank cites at the end of The Easy Rider, where Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda's free-willing young hippies are shot dead in cold blood by two inbred rednecks in a pickup truck, as an example of the culture gap that began to widen in the 1960s. Those palookas didn't necessarily need to be the enemy, but their working-class dads probably had voted for FDR 4 times in a row, and the same could be said of the famous scene in 5 Easy Pieces, where Jack Nicholson berates the diner waitress who was probably living on tips and just trying to get through a long shift, not exactly sticking it to the man. the Republicans haven't changed its general economic policies much since the Gilded Age. When asked why they seem to be better at playing pretend populism, Frank points out that they are totally cynical. They have seen their opportunities and they have taken them. We're all still reeling from how folksy types like Reagan and George W. Bush aped the populist style while legislating the opposite way. As for today's Democratic Party, Frank thinks it needs to focus on bringing together working people across the board. With the Republican issues, you could easily assemble massive coalitions that would easily overwhelm the Republicans. Make it easy to form labor unions again. You can't have a Democrat without a mass movement behind it. Certainly, the issues that animated the populist tradition over a century ago are still as urgently relevant as ever. Maybe that urgency has reached a breakthrough point thanks to the perpetual incompetence and banality of Washington's status quo, but if so, it would also happen to be up to the voters, otherwise known as the people, to make this happen. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Random Mike, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.